An elderly woman's purse was searched on Main Street at 2:17 p.m. on a Tuesday. No warrant, no probable cause, just a uniform and a command that brooked no argument. She didn't resist, didn't question, just stood with shoulders hunched as personal items scattered on the sidewalk. Lipstick, medicine, a faded photograph of grandchildren. 3 people filmed it. 17 watched. None spoke. When Officer Donnelly found nothing, he didn't apologize. Simply walked away, leaving her to gather what dignity remained along with her belongings. For 3 days after the town fell silent, not the silence of peace, but of something festering beneath floorboards. In diners, customers lowered voices when uniforms entered. On playgrounds, children stopped running when patrol cars passed. This isn't a story about petty theft or random search. This is about a system jolted awake by a single blank page. A page that found its way into the hands of a girl who understood that true power isn't in shouting louder than injustice. It's in knowing exactly where to place the quietest question. A girl who learned that systems aren't changed by those who speak truth to power. They're transformed by those who speak law to authority. And sometimes the most dangerous person in the room isn't the one with a weapon. It's the one with a constitution. The book hit the ground with a dull thud. Pages splayed open against wet concrete words blurring under afternoon sun. A boy no older than 12 reached for it with trembling fingers. Tears streaked his dark cheeks, but he made no sound. "What do kids like you need books for, to vandalize them?" Officer Eric Donnelly towered over him, flashlight tapping against his palm, though daylight still filled the street. The boy's backpack lay upturned beside him, school supplies scattered across the library steps. His math homework fluttered in the breeze, equations dissolving into meaningless symbols under the officer's boot. "I was just going home, sir. I didn't do anything wrong." His voice barely audible, eyes fixed on the ground. Donnelly's radio crackled. He ignored it instead, nudging the fallen book with his foot. "Funny how you people always claim innocence." From across the street, Miriam Bennett watched. Her library ID card still hung around her neck, keys clutched tight in her palm. She crossed against the light purpose hardening her steps. "Excuse me, officer. Is there a problem?" Her voice carried the practiced calm of someone who'd mediated 1,000 library disputes. Donnelly turned, annoyance flashing across his face. "Ma'am, this doesn't concern you." "He's one of our regular students. I can vouch for him." Miriam stepped closer, positioning herself slightly between the boy and Donnelly. "Step back, ma'am. Police business." Donnelly's hand pushed against her shoulder, firm enough to make her stumble. Miriam steadied herself, reaching slowly into her pocket. She withdrew her phone finger, hovering over the record button. Something shifted in Donnelly's posture. He stepped back, eyes narrowing at the device. "Keep your nose out of police work." The threat hung in the air between them. Miriam didn't respond. She simply held the phone's steady screen facing Donnelly, recording light blinking. Donnelly's radio crackled again. This time he answered it, backing away without another word. The boy gathered his belongings, hands still shaking. "Thank you, Ms. Bennett." Miriam nodded, watching Donnelly retreat to his patrol car. She kept recording until the vehicle disappeared around the corner. Only then did she exhale. The Bennett home stood unchanged from the outside, a modest 2-story in a quiet neighborhood where chain-link fences had long replaced white pickets. But inside walls held no family portraits. Instead, framed constitutional amendments hung like sacred texts, their glass catching evening light. Amari Bennett sat at the dining table, fingers moving methodically across paper. Not homework, at least not the kind her classmates would recognize. She was analyzing case files, her neat handwriting filling margins with citations and precedents. At 16, Amari carried herself with the quiet dignity of someone far older. Her braided hair was pulled back tightly, revealing a face serious beyond its years. Eyes that studied rather than merely saw. The front door opened. Miriam entered, shoulders heavy with the day. She placed her bag on the counter, keys making a soft clink against laminate. "Eric Donnelly again?" Amari asked without looking up. Miriam nodded, filling a glass with water. "Harassing Marcus outside the library. Same routine. Dumped his backpack, scattered his books." Amari's pen paused mid-sentence. "Did you record it?" "Yes, I've sent it to the community watch group." Miriam sat across from her daughter, studying the papers spread across the table. "Fourth Amendment case studies." Precedents on wrongful search and seizure. Amari pushed a folder toward her mother. I found 3 cases where evidence was dismissed due to procedural violations. No teddy bears adorned Amari's childhood bedroom. No posters of musicians or movie stars covered her walls. Instead, a whiteboard dominated one wall, meticulously organized with color-coded sections on civil rights violations, procedural errors, and defense strategies. In permanent marker at the top, a single line read, "I am not from a family of law. I am the law born into the body of a child denied the right to breathe." Dinner in the Bennett household wasn't served with small talk about school dances or television shows. Instead, mother and daughter discussed legal strategies between bites of food. The school board finally responded to my letter, Amari said, passing a folded paper across the table. Miriam scanned it, a small smile forming. They're reviewing Mr. Patterson's grading policies. After I cited Brown v. Board of Education and included the comparative grade statistics. Amari's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes lightened. He can't keep marking students down for excessive questioning of textbook narratives. You were 13 when you wrote your first protest letter, Miriam said, pride warming her voice. The principal never saw it coming. Night fell outside their windows, but Amari continued working. Long after Miriam had gone to bed, she sat at her desk lamp, casting sharp shadows across old case files, her father's files. She underlined passages with careful precision, occasionally pausing to make notes. No music played, no phone buzzed with messages, just the soft scratch of pen against paper and the weight of memory. A single photograph sat on her desk, her father in military uniform standing tall beside a flag. Captain Malik Bennett, his eyes holding the same intensity that now lived in his daughters. Amari's fingers traced the edge of the frame, then returned to her work. Morning light filtered through bus windows, casting stripes across Amari's lap. She sat alone, a thick gray book open before her, The Constitution and Federal Judiciary. Other students scrolled through phones or dozed against backpacks. Amari highlighted passages, her focus undisturbed by the bus's jolting stops. The vehicle slowed at the corner of 82nd Street and Hill Ridge, a neighborhood where homes sat back from the street, protected by manicured lawns and security systems. Amari gathered her belongings, stepping onto sun-warmed concrete. The bus pulled away, leaving her standing alone. This wasn't her neighborhood. The gleaming white SUVs lining the curb belonged to families whose names appeared on donor walls, not in public housing registries. Amari checked her watch. 20 minutes until the next bus would take her to the pre-law program at the community college. She reviewed her exam checklist, turning pages with careful precision. A patrol car slowed beside her. Officer Eric Donnelly studied her through mirrored sunglasses, his gaze lingering on her backpack. He pulled to the curb driver's door, opening with practiced efficiency. "What are you doing in this neighborhood?" His voice wasn't loud, but it carried authority designed to intimidate. A couple walking their dog turned to watch. Amari looked up, her expression calm. "I'm waiting for the bus. The stop is 2 blocks away." Donnelly approached, posture suggesting routine rather than emergency. "Let me see your backpack." No reason given, no rights read. Amari hesitated for just a moment, then slowly unstrapped her bag. She placed it on the ground, opening each compartment methodically. Donnelly didn't wait. He snatched the backpack, flipped it upside down, and dumped the contents onto the sidewalk. Notebooks, pens, and highlighters scattered across concrete, some rolling toward the gutter. The book Amari had been holding, The Constitution and Federal Judiciary, slipped from her hand. It fell open to page 62, where the Fifth Amendment was printed in bold text. A small plastic bag appeared beneath the book's spine. White powder filled it, positioned too perfectly to be accidental. "What the hell is this?" Donnelly lifted the bag, feigning surprise. "Hiding drugs inside your law book. That's creative." Amari didn't speak. She simply bent down, picked up her book, and looked directly into the body camera on Donnelly's chest. "Fifth Amendment," she said clearly. "I invoke my right to remain silent." A middle-aged man on a bicycle stopped, pulling out his phone to record. "Getting arrested for reading now." "This doesn't concern you," Donnelly snapped, but the man kept filming. Amari stood perfectly still. "Do you remember the exact time you stopped me?" The question hung in the air, simple yet somehow unsettling. Donnelly didn't answer. Instead, he spun Amari around, yanking her arms behind her back. Cold metal handcuffs clicked into place. "Sit down!" He pushed her toward the patrol car hood. Her forehead touched hot metal, but she didn't flinch. A streak of blue ink transferred from her hand to the white hood. Ink from the scholarship exam she'd submitted that morning. The essay topic, Constitutional Protection in a Biased Society. The wind caught a loose page from her scattered notes, carrying it toward a storm drain. "Move along, nothing to see here," Donnelly called to the gathering crowd. But they saw everything: a black girl pinned against a patrol car, a law book thrown open, hands bound behind her back, despite no resistance. A woman whispered to her young son, "Look closely. Sometimes being right won't save you." Amari remained silent, eyes moving deliberately across each face in the crowd, as if committing them to memory. The backup officer arrived, asking, "What's the charge?" Donnelly sealed the white powder in an evidence bag. "Drugs, intentional possession." The second officer glanced at Amari, then nodded without checking further. That was procedure. That was routine. Amari was guided into the cruiser, her head bumping against the doorframe. Her lips tightened, but no sound escaped them. The man with the bicycle continued filming as the patrol car drove away. His caption read, "She was arrested just for holding the wrong book in the wrong place." Within an hour, the video had 20,000 views. Kunyuan. Hill Ridge Police Station smelled of industrial cleaner and stale coffee. The fluorescent lights cast everyone in the same sickly pallor, erasing distinctions between officers and those they brought in. Donnelly led Amari through narrow corridors, his grip firm on her still-cuffed wrists. He pushed open the door to an interrogation room. Small, windowless, furnished only with a metal table and 3 chairs. "You think you're a lawyer, huh?" His voice rasped with contempt. Amari raised her head. The second officer didn't read Miranda. The air in the room shifted. A young officer standing in the corner opened his mouth to speak, but a sharp glance from a superior behind the observation glass silenced him. Donnelly stood grabbing a marker. He turned to the whiteboard mounted on the wall. "All right then, genius. So you were standing here." He marked a circle, then drew a wildly curved line. "When I approached from this side," he sketched a rectangle meant to represent the bus stop. "That's the scene." He turned, expression smug. Amari didn't look at the board. Instead, she glanced at her watch. "The bus stop is west, but there's no traffic light on the west side. Your map's pointing in the wrong direction." Something cracked in Donnelly's confidence. Not because she was right, but because she spoke as if he were her student. Behind the observation glass, a female staffer clutched a file tightly. She'd transferred to Hill Ridge only 2 weeks ago. She recognized right from wrong, but lacked the courage to act on it, especially when her supervisor had just silenced her with a look. Amari sat with hands resting on the table palms open. No tension in her posture, no defensive gestures. Donnelly flipped open a temporary detention report. The recorded time of arrest, 14:17 hours. Amari extended her wrist, revealing a digital watch. The display read 13:56. The discrepancy wasn't large, but it was enough to create doubt about the timeline in Donnelly's statement. "Systems can be wrong," Donnelly muttered. "No evidence, no crime." Amari replied, her tone measured. A faint click came from the hallway camera. Though Donnelly believed it had been turned off, it continued recording. It captured his muttered words just before entering the room. "This black needs to be taught a lesson." Donnelly slammed the folder shut. A pen rolled off the table to Amari's feet. She didn't pick it up. The interrogation ended without a statement, without signatures. Amari was taken to a holding cell without any formal detention order. She sat on the narrow bench, looking through the reinforced glass window where late afternoon shadows stretched across the parking lot. Her expression revealed nothing of her thoughts. Courtroom 4 of Hill Ridge City Hall was designed to intimidate with its high ceiling and dark wood paneling. Judge Stephen Mallory presided from an elevated bench, looking down at Amari with barely concealed disdain. "Who does this little girl think she is, teenage Ruth Bader Ginsburg?" The judge's laughter encouraged others in the room to join in. Amari didn't react. She opened a thin folder, removed a handwritten petition in blue ink, and slid it toward the court clerk. "I waive court-appointed counsel. I request to represent myself under the precedent of Gideon v. Wainwright, 372 U.S. 335, 1963, and my constitutional right to act as my own legal representative. Her words weren't delivered as a proclamation, but stated as fact. Clear, precise, undeniable. The courtroom fell silent for 3 seconds. The court-appointed attorney, a middle-aged white man in an oversized suit, lowered his glasses. "I've never seen a student like that," he muttered loud enough for the microphone to catch. In the back row, a retired lawyer leaned toward his companion. "This girl, she's not playing." Amari stood alone, no microphone, no legal pad, no supporting counsel. Just a 16-year-old girl facing a system designed to process rather than listen. "I was taken into custody without being read Miranda," she said, eyes fixed on the prosecutor. "The arrest report lists the wrong time. The hallway camera captured a statement that violates conduct standards. And most of all, the crime scene diagram is drawn in the wrong direction, in the wrong location, and lacks any direct physical evidence." Her voice remained steady. No inflection, no pleading, no bitterness. Each word landed with the precision of a hammer driving nails. Eric Donnelly sat at the prosecution table, lips pressed tight, hands clenched beneath the table. He had faced hundreds of defendants, thieves, addicts, resistors, but none had made him sweat like this girl who carried a law book instead of a weapon. "I will now present 3 fundamental legal principles," Amari continued. "First, the Fourth Amendment protects citizens against unreasonable search and seizure. Second, the Fifth Amendment protection against self-incrimination. And third, the Sixth, the right to a fair and public trial." She recited without notes, each article memorized like directions home. From the back of the courtroom, people began recording on their phones. They no longer saw just a black girl. They witnessed something dangerous to those accustomed to unchallenged power. A citizen who knew the law and knew how to demand its protection. Judge Mallory tapped his pen against his nameplate. "Young lady, do you think this is a courtroom or a kindergarten?" The question landed like a slap. Amari met his gaze directly. "I don't think. I know." Those 4 words silenced the room. The clerk stopped typing. Donnelly glanced around, searching for solidarity, but finding only averted eyes. Sunlight streamed through the high windows, illuminating Amari's neatly braided hair. She stood in the system without bowing, her presence an accusation that required no shouting. Amari's words, "I know," echoed in the minds of many as she was escorted back to the holding cell after the hearing. The walls of that cell were bare, institutional beige, but they couldn't contain what had just happened in the courtroom. To know and to dare say, "I know," in a place where people tried to convince her she knew nothing, there had to be a foundation for that confidence. Not a classroom, not a church, a home. The Bennett household had never been filled with fairy tales before bedtime. No teddy bear nightlights, no music boxes, no dolls in pink dresses. Instead, the walls were covered in printed case law from an old desktop printer. Edges trimmed, precisely posted straight, not tilted by even a fraction, like sacred murals warning of survival. In that house, wall corners weren't used to hang family pictures, but to display full articles of the Constitution. Not for decoration, but for defense. Captain Malek Bennett had been a military legal officer in the United States Army, a man whose voice was warm as southern redwood, who wore shoes polished like mirrors and uniforms that never seemed to wrinkle. Behind that disciplined exterior lived a mind sharp as a bayonet and a spine that bowed before no rank. He had investigated a series of violations in internal budget allocations. He died in an investigative accident with no witnesses, no camera footage, and no evidence. The report stated he slipped while exiting evidence storage. But Amari knew better. Men like her father didn't slip. He walked by the principle, not by the heel. His death left behind no will, no inheritance, only an old USB drive hidden inside a torn-spined copy of the Federal Procedure Handbook. Amari found it at 13 when the book fell from the shelf after a sudden gust of wind. Her mother Miriam never taught Amari lullabies or fairy tales. She taught her how to distinguish between precedent and assumption, taught her that the law wasn't something to fear, but something to face directly. "Study law not to win," she would repeat the words left behind by her husband, "but to survive." Because in a world where skin color determines presumption, where gender defines position, and where every small mistake could become a life sentence, The law is the only thing that lets you stand upright without trembling. In their kitchen, there was no decorative menu on the wall. Instead, a faded copy of the Fourth Amendment, printed on yellowed paper taped with brown packing tape, its corners curled from years of steam and scrutiny. By the window, a neighborhood map with red markings showing areas with histories of baseless arrests. On the dining table, legal volumes stood where floral arrangements might have been in other homes. They ate beside the law. They conversed through case studies. They lived as if every sentence of the Constitution was blood coursing through their veins. Amari's room contained no wallpaper, only a whiteboard. On it, she wrote in permanent marker, "I am not from a family of law. I am the law born into the body of a child denied the right to breathe." Beneath it was a list of self-studied cases, constitutional clauses to memorize, and common procedural errors police often made during unlawful arrests. She studied the way others breathed, not because she enjoyed it, but because she had to. No one in her neighborhood knew that the girl with the braids once sat reading her father's case files until 2 a.m., underlining every line with a dim desk lamp and dry tears. No one knew that when she first found her father's USB, she didn't open it right away, but held it against her chest, afraid that turning it on would unleash a truth so painful it might prevent her from ever standing again. And no one knew that she had taught herself how to exist in a world where people train you to obey before you ever learn how to say no. That house, lined with case law, was no longer an impenetrable fortress the moment Amari's name appeared on the morning legal bulletin. After her first court appearance, when the video of the black girl citing the law in open court spread at an uncontrollable pace, things began to shift. Not on the news, not before cameras, but through invisible messages. Voiceless, faceless lines of text carrying the stench of a war never declared but always fought. That afternoon, just as Amari stepped through the front door, after another meeting with the court-appointed attorney, she had firmly rejected her friend Ila's phone lit up. Not a call, just a message with no number, no name. 7 words. Want to disappear like her father did. The message vanished after 3 seconds, leaving no trace in the inbox. Ila handed the phone to her mother, hands shaking. Her mother called the police, but they only asked one question before falling silent. "Which girl's case is your daughter involved with?" Then they hung up. That was the first time Ila understood that the system wasn't coming to protect, especially not when the threatened was a friend of the girl making the system tremble. That night, a video surfaced on an anonymous YouTube channel. No effects, no music, just raw footage from a military internal hearing a decade ago. Amari's father, Captain Malik Bennett, sat between 3 men in high-ranking uniforms. His voice was calm but hard as granite. "I believe if I continue this investigation, I'll uncover a connection between our unit's budget allocations and a local police group." One of the men flinched, interjecting, "Bennett, you're overstepping." He replied, "My limits are defined by law." The video faded out with no conclusion, but at the very end, one thing became clear. The man seated at the far right of the table, the internal affairs officer, was none other than Eric Donnelly, back when he still held the rank of lieutenant. Amari watched the video in silence. She opened the old USB drive, checking the creation date of the file. It matched the day her father died. No one could fake something left behind by the dead. She knew then that she had touched something far larger than a wrongful arrest. Later that evening, her mother noticed something strange. The home security camera system had shut down. The cables were connected. The lights were still on, but the data logs between 1300 and 1430, the window during which Amari had been arrested, were entirely blank, as if those moments never existed. Amari didn't panic. She didn't cry. She didn't pound the table. She simply stepped back, opened her laptop, and launched the secondary log system her father had installed years ago. She knew the primary could be wiped, but the backup had a separate password that only she knew. And just as she'd suspected it was all there, the footage of her standing in the street, shoved against the patrol car, the book flying open to the Fifth Amendment, the white powder sliding out from the book's spine. Everything had been recorded not in blood, but in data. A quiet boy from school, Zion, once suspended for tampering with attendance systems, found Amari after class. No small talk. He placed a USB drive on her desk. "I recovered the original log from the school cameras on the day you were arrested. Someone tried to erase it, but they didn't erase everything. The screen showed jumbled code, and tucked between the chaos was an internal chat message. "Handle that girl." It was sent from an IP address tied to a workstation at the local precinct. At the exact moment the cameras were shut off. No names, no signatures, just that one line. But to someone who knew the law, that alone was enough to prove this was no longer a procedural mistake. This was a plan. An anonymous Twitter account profile image, a strip of black duct tape handle, "Silent Witness," sent Amari one message: "Never trust anyone wearing a name tag." Attached was a redacted internal memo. What chilled Amari wasn't the content. It was the placement of the official seal. It sat precisely in the area her father had once exposed as the records forging hub used to conceal overreach. Every connection, every line of text, every system log, it didn't come from one person. It came from a system. And that system had begun to realize this child wasn't here to beg for mercy. She was here to blow the lid off. The clip of Amari's arrest, filmed by a bystander's phone, was shared thousands of times on Reddit, especially in the police overreach exposed community. One prominent user posted, "Black girl self-represents, cites the law exposes misconduct." But what gave me chills was her eyes staring into the camera like she was memorizing every face that laughed while her wrists were being tied. On Black Twitter, the video paired with a photo of her father in uniform. The caption, "He once stood for the law, now she stands for the truth." Over 1 million shares. But for Amari, going viral wasn't the goal. Being seen wasn't a victory. Truth doesn't need an audience, it just needs light. And she understood this well. Light doesn't come from a single courtroom speech. It comes from dragging out every hidden bolt in the system, every buried message, every suppressed log, every whispered word behind closed doors, and exposing them, not with tears but with evidence. That night, as the house settled into stillness, Amari sat alone at the wooden table. She opened her father's files one by one, combing through every line marking each case that mentioned the name Eric Donnelly. Not for revenge, not for payback, but to prove one thing: if they once believed darkness could kill the light, this time the light would unmask that darkness. The night before the second hearing, Amari didn't pray. She didn't write in a journal. She simply printed out 5 copies of her state's arrest procedure statutes, marking each procedural violation she had identified in her own case file. She knew that in the morning no one in the courtroom would want to hear her speak. But she didn't need to be believed. She needed to be heard. Morning light poured through the courtroom windows, stirring the stale air. Amari entered with a slim folder in hand, white button shirt tucked to the collar, hair braided tightly. No one expected to witness anything more than a routine preliminary hearing. But when she placed her hand on the witness stand and raised her head, speaking each word with surgical precision, the room held its breath. "I don't need to be believed. I need to be heard." Judge Mallory didn't interrupt her for the first time. Not out of respect, but because he didn't know where he could interrupt when every syllable she uttered was a complete and self-contained structure of exposure. "The arrest report logs the detainment time as 14:17, she said, holding up a 2-page photocopy. "But the GPS data from my watch, a device legally accepted by the state as supplemental evidence, shows the stop occurred at 13:56. This discrepancy is unaddressed in the initial investigation, violating Section 207B of the State Penal Code." Her words drove into the courtroom floor like steel nails into rotting wood. In the gallery, an elderly man, a retired attorney of 40 years, began taking notes with a blue ink pen. His hand trembled slightly, but the strokes were firm as cold-forged steel. Amari didn't stop. She turned to the second page, presenting a comparative chart of the patrol car's video retrieval process. Dashboard camera footage under Departmental Regulation 17.3 must be continuously stored for 72 hours prior to backup, except in cases of documented system failure. No such maintenance report was filed by Patrol Unit 7 Delta during the time of my arrest. This indicates either intentional neglect or unlawful interference with evidence. At the prosecution's table, Eric Donnelly showed the first signs of panic. He clenched his hands so tightly the knuckles turned white, then instinctively ran a hand through his hair, a gesture uncharacteristic of a man so meticulously composed. "Hallway camera footage at the precinct," she continued, recorded Officer Donnelly stating just before entering the interrogation room, "This black needs to be taught a lesson." Her voice didn't rise, didn't press, but each syllable struck like a whistle, signaling the launch of a legal ambush. No weapons, no threats, just accuracy. The court clerk's pen paused. The judge's pen halted mid-stroke precisely as she cited the procedural failure to provide legal oversight during the detainment. Judge Mallory slowly looked up, his gaze meeting hers for the first time, not with the air of bestowing authority, but with the weariness reserved only for those capable of setting precedent. A small legal blog began circulating just after recess. Black girl makes white cop go silent. The post spread not because of the writer, but because of the subject. In the photo, Amari stood at the witness stand, one hand gripping a statute, the other holding her folder, her face taut with purposeful silence. Behind her sat Eric Donnelly, collar askew, eyes vacant like a man lost inside a storm of reason. Amari closed the folder. She didn't thank the court, didn't bow. She said just one thing before leaving the stand. The law isn't meant to intimidate. It's meant to prevent fear. Enortim, that sentence fell like a weight into the core of a system long accustomed to wielding law as a tool of suppression. Now it was being used against them. Not to punish, but to block those who wear the title of protector while tearing it down from within. Eric stood. He meant to speak, but no sound came out. For the first time in 20 years of service, his hands trembled as he prepared to address the court. Sweat soaked the back of his collar. His steps faltered as he returned to his seat. His eyes scanned the courtroom, searching for even a single look of solidarity from his peers. But all he found were bowed heads. Not in shame, but in fear of being dragged in. When Amari sat down, she didn't exhale heavily. She didn't smile. She simply curled her hand into a fist in her lap, tight enough to feel the beat of her own heart. No one applauded, no one cheered. But from the far corner of the room, the old retired lawyer rose and gave a slight nod. He said nothing, just a nod, as if to confirm he had just witnessed a moment of history. The first time a black girl stood in a white courtroom and made the law breathe again through her own voice. When Amari stepped down from the stand, the courtroom had yet to regain its natural rhythm of breath. But the system does not wait for anyone to breathe. It began shifting silently, moving like a fever simmering within the body of a patient, still smiling at the cameras. As soon as the hearing adjourned in a meeting room just a few blocks away, men in gray suits sat around a marble table and started a conversation with no recording. No minutes, but one silent witness, an investigative journalist who had once followed the suspicious death of Captain Malik Bennett. A mini recorder had been planted beneath the wooden seat exactly where Eric Donnelly sat. His voice came through slow and bitter like poison, steeped too long in warm water. That girl's not going to stop. She's digging all the way down. I know that type. Just like her father. A fellow officer to his left responded, voice dry and cold as a sentence being handed down. Well, her father's dead, isn't he? No one laughed. No one objected. Only a silence longer than necessary hung in the air before the legal advisor, a woman with frizzy hair and tortoiseshell glasses, released a line that nearly made the recorder vibrate. This girl knows what we've been trying to bury. At the police station in the basement records room, accessible only by commanding officers, a copy of Captain Malik Bennett's personnel file suddenly disappeared. No alert, no access log, no trace of intrusion into the system. When the archivist was asked, she stammered, I've never seen it. But the hallway camera, a relic thought to be outdated, captured footage of a masked man in a baseball cap entering at exactly 2 a.m., a time no one was officially scheduled to work. The next afternoon, Amari's mother received a package with no return address. Inside was an old leather-bound notebook, faded and worn. On the first page was a familiar line. If you're reading this, it means the truth still has a chance. The signature beneath was her father's. The notebook contained fragments of his unfinished investigative journal, detailing day-by-day observations as he tracked unethical activities between military officers and civilian police networks. The names inside were no longer unfamiliar, among them Eric Donnelly. Some entries were hurried, scribbled at odd angles, clearly written while driving or hiding, but every line blazed like silver bullets aimed straight at the system that had killed him. In the command room of the city police department, the police chief, who had signed off on Amari's arrest without question, watched the full footage of the detainment. He said nothing for the first 4 minutes, but at the moment the girl lifted her wrist to show the time and recited legal code in the middle of the street, He set his pen down, leaned back and whispered, "She knows exactly what she's doing." At a media office contracted with the department, a crisis meeting was underway. Amari's image was spreading too fast beyond containment. One advisor, rubbing his forehead with bloodshot eyes from a sleepless night, proposed, "We need to make this girl look radical. Attach a narrative of resentment. Suggest that her father had political ties or was involved in an activist group. Destroy the image before it becomes a symbol." No one disagreed. No one asked ethical questions. In that room, images weren't reflections of truth. They were shields to hide it. Eric Donnelly received news he'd been recorded while standing in the parking lot after the meeting. He slammed his hand onto the car hood, leaving a dent. Sweat pooled at his temples. His hands trembled so much that he couldn't get the key into the lock. He pulled out his phone to call someone at Internal Affairs, but hung up mid-dial. He knew the more he called, the more he revealed. The more he spoke, the more he could be heard. And this time, he wasn't controlling the recorder. The recorder was beginning to control him. A phone call from an unknown number rang the main office of the police department. The deputy chief's assistant picked up. On the other end, a male voice, deep and firm. "This is the Office of Special Investigation FBI. We need to meet immediately with legal representation regarding Eric Donnelly's personnel file. There are signs of misconduct tied to a chain of activities dating back to 2014. Please do not disclose this communication." No further explanation. The call ended. Not a warning, not a request, just a notification, and the system began to feel the tightening grip. Not from the outside, but from within. Amari knew nothing of the meetings, the slammed fists on tables, the files pulled from drawers in the dead of night, the deleted emails still lingering in server caches. She only knew one thing: when someone like Donnelly starts going silent, it's not because the truth is still hidden, but because it's beginning to take shape. She continued taking notes, quoting statutes, and reviewing her father's records. She didn't know the faces of those sitting in the dark, but every step she took made that darkness blink. And when darkness starts listening, it's no longer a safe place for those who live by lies. Night fell like a thick velvet curtain. But in Amari's house, darkness was not the most frightening thing. It was the silence slipping into every wooden crack, every corner of the table, every breath that made closing one's eyes impossible. After everything she had said in that courtroom, after the evidence laid bare before the public, after the look in Eric Donnelly's eyes lowered not from remorse, but from fear, tonight was the first night Amari would not sleep. Not because she was weak, but because she was remembering. Her father's files were still there, spread across the old table. His notebook opened to page 13, where the handwriting began to rush, ink spattered, as though written in a moving car. "If I die, the girl will replace me." His voice, preserved in a grainy recording, pulled from the rusted USB, echoed faintly from a small speaker. Each word cut deeply into her flesh and bone. Amari played that recording 8 times. Each time was a loop between her spine and memory, making the hand holding the pen tremble with every stroke. But her eyes remained lit, as if every street lamp in the city had poured itself into the pupils of a girl interrogating justice. She didn't cry. She had never cried over her father's death because her mother once taught her, tears are not a language the system listens to. What they fear are arguments, evidence, and questions that don't need to be shouted, yet silence an entire room. "Never begin from fear," her father had once written in the letter he left behind. No poetry, no philosophy, just instruction. Like the way he once taught her how to cite laws, how to outline a case, how to see through a verdict written in collective silence. Her mother stood at the kitchen door, eyes on the backyard where the streetlight cast a shadow of someone retreating from the wall. She didn't speak until she was sure they were gone. Then she locked the door softly, as if not to wake the memories that had slept in this house for 8 years. "You're not here to avenge," she said, eyes fixed on the lock. "You're here to live as if they never twisted you." A simple sentence, but it struck Amari's chest like a declaration. Her father died for being right. She was alive to make sure that rightness was never buried again. On the table beside the files and notes were 7 small slips of paper, handwritten in black ink. She called them the 7 points of refutation. They were her plan, her ammunition, her campaign map, crafted by someone with no army, no backing, just intellect. Each point was a hairline crack she'd found in reports, testimony, and spliced videos. Every line she wrote wasn't meant to impress. It was meant to force the system to accept not all black children are blind to the law. Some know it and are ready to wield it as a weapon of righteousness. Her phone vibrated once. Not a threat this time. An email. Subject, request for interview from London. A foreign journalist asking for permission to interview. The message was simple. Your voice is being heard, not just here. She didn't reply. She didn't need to be heard. She needed to be judged fairly. She didn't need to speak to the world. She needed the world to look at the law she was exposing. A world that had grown used to turning its back on those too quiet was now being forced to listen to someone who didn't shout, but whose every word left it speechless. The video of Amari citing the law in court reached 3 million views in under 48 hours. Hashtags like Goshen Black Girl, Knows Law, Josh Shiz the Constitution, and Amari Bennett spread like oil on the chaotic sea of information. But she didn't care. She didn't read the comments, didn't check reactions. She just wrote, just read, just sat upright in the silent room beneath the harsh yellow light in the repeating sound of her father's voice like a war drum. If I die, the girl will replace me. Her mother sat at the table across from her, said nothing. Just held a notebook occasionally, glanced at the window, occasionally placed a hand on her daughter's shoulder. Not to comfort, but as a way of passing down the endurance that had been forged through years of caring too much. That house didn't need lullabies. It lived by the sound of keys clacking paper, rustling the old printer, groaning as it pushed out lines of truth. Like every printed page was another brick laid not on her father's grave, but on the grave of forgetting. At 1:01 a.m., Amari stood, packed the documents into a leather case, folded the 7 points of refutation, and tucked them neatly into her binder. She walked to the window, drew the curtain back, just to see the street light reflecting her face in the glass. No longer a child, no longer a high school student. She saw in her eyes the silhouette of a legal soldier wearing no armor, wielding no weapon, yet advancing toward the most powerful enemy, systemic deception. No one knew what tomorrow would bring, but Amari knew one thing: she would not tremble. Not because she bore her father's name, not because his blood ran in her veins, but because his voice still echoed in her ear, like a declaration that would never expire. Never begin from fear. And she wasn't beginning tonight. She was continuing. No one really slept after that night, but when Amari stepped into the courtroom for the third time, the system still pretended everything was under the old order. Judge Mallory sat straighter than usual, his collar perfectly aligned without a single stray thread. The prosecutor no longer looked at her with contempt, but with a chilling caution. Eric Donnelly had arrived early, holding a stack of documents misaligned at the margins. Dark circles sunken deep beneath a layer of concealer masked his exhaustion. But Amari's eyes didn't stop on him. Today she wasn't here to prove she was right. She came to expose who was wrong. She opened her file and placed it on the stand. The hearing began. Before this court, she said, her tone steady but forged like tempered steel, I present a comparison of the incident scene map provided by the prosecution with the actual layout verified by geospatial data and satellite imagery dated June 17th. She held up 2 printed documents, one from the police department, one from publicly available satellite data. The discrepancy was clear at the intersection where the arrest took place. The prosecution's map misidentified the street orientation and misplaced a convenience store by nearly 50 meters. A seemingly minor inconsistency, she continued, eyes sweeping across the room. But in criminal law, an error in location alters the movement trajectory, and without a clear foundation to define the suspected action, all charges become speculative. The prosecutor opened his mouth but said nothing. The court clerk reached to adjust the microphone. A journalist in the third row quietly pressed record. Amari turned and stepped down 2 steps and faced the witness stand where Eric Donnelly sat stiffly. She didn't shout. She didn't shake. She simply said, Do you remember me from when you destroyed my father's case? The question was not just a challenge. It was a knife slicing through the wall of silence the system had built for 8 years. The room fell still. The only sound was the ceiling fan creaking like it was tearing open a mask of morality. Eric looked at her, his face drained of color. I didn't know your father. The words came out reflexively, but no one in the room believed them. She didn't argue. She didn't protest. She opened her file and pulled out an old fax. Yellowed paper, but the text was still sharp. She held it high, turning it toward the judge. This is a document confirming that Lieutenant Eric Donnelly, then serving as internal liaison, signed to receive an investigative report submitted by Captain Malik Bennett on September 14th, 8 years ago. No one laughed, no one clapped. Only the camera shutters clicked, echoing like a heartbeat monitor tracking a system entering cardiac arrest. Eric leaned forward about to speak, but the prosecutor placed a hand on his arm, light enough to feel like a warning. They all knew every word uttered now could be the grave of any future defense. The courtroom buzzed. A law student in the back row, live-streaming the hearing, whispered into his mic, "This trial belongs in textbooks." Social media lit up. On Twitter, the hashtag #RememberMalik reappeared, paired with images of Amari's father in uniform, his solemn expression seeming to gaze at the very truth he had spent his life trying to expose. A truth wrapped in uniforms and sealed in warrants. The facts wasn't the end. Another name emerged in the file, Janine Holloway, a former witness in her father's case who had retracted her testimony citing psychological stress. Next to her name in the margins was a note, "Threatened. No capacity for protection." The courtroom froze. A man in the back row pulled out his phone and texted a former classmate, "The girl just exposed an entire chain of internal misconduct. This isn't child's play." Judge Mallory, who had been trying to maintain neutrality, raised his hand for the first time, lightly tapping his gavel and calling a 15-minute recess. But the reason he gave wasn't lengthy proceedings or witness fatigue. It was, "The hearing is triggering unforeseen public response." A different way of saying public pressure was tightening the noose around the necks of those who once thought themselves immune to consequence. In the private break room, Eric stared into the mirror. He no longer saw an officer, just a gaunt man with hollow eyes, trembling hands, and a wrinkled collar. The reflection showed him something he never thought he'd see. Not a defendant, but someone being judged. He raised his fist and struck the mirror. The cracks split from his forehead outward, like fractures spreading through whatever conscience he still had, if he had any left. Amari sat alone on the bench, the window casting a slanted ray of light across her face, dividing it in two. On one side, a 16-year-old girl still growing. On the other, the shadow of a woman forcing an entire system to re-examine its every word. She said nothing. She didn't need to. What needed to be said, she had said. What needed to be exposed, she had exposed. And what needed to be tried was now taking form before the eyes of millions who no longer trusted voices that spoke from behind power. When the hearing reconvened, the footsteps exiting the courtroom no longer sounded like those of spectators. They echoed like the faltering pulses of an overloaded machine. The system was not built to be questioned. It was designed to judge, not to be judged. But that morning it was Amari, a 16-year-old black girl, who made it sit in the defendant's chair. And no one dared object. After everything she had cornered Eric into, hesitantly admitting no one could still believe it was just a misunderstanding. And when silence can no longer kill intelligence, people begin to understand. Some children aren't born to bow their heads. They're born to make others lower theirs. She didn't go home right after court. She went to the old library where her mother worked, a small room behind dusty shelves where light cut through wooden blinds and landed squarely on a gray-painted safe, the kind only chosen by people who understand what it means to live under lifelong surveillance. Her mother opened it without a word. She placed a small matte black USB into Amari's hand, unmarked. "Your father said," she spoke softly, "not to open it until you were strong enough not to step back after learning the truth." No further explanation was needed. Both women understood. This gift wasn't meant to remember. It was meant to resurrect what others tried to bury. Amari returned home and plugged the USB into her laptop. Hands steady, but her heartbeat thudding into every joint like a war drum. Inside was a single folder, one lone file, Internal Investigation, EIRD. She opened it. The reports appeared, not from third-party sources, not speculation, not rumor. These were official documents compiled by the military's Internal Affairs Division, sealed in October of that year. One section read, "Officer Donnelly under investigation for abuse of authority in handling civilian subjects. Evidence of concealment. Traced to legal advisor William Greaves, who currently holds office at the State Department of Justice." She didn't say a word. She simply turned on the printer and began printing page by page. Thick stock black ink, every line crisp like a declaration. 18 pages in total, bound into a deep red folder. Not for show, but like dried blood given shape. She left the house with the folder in hand, eyes unwavering. She wasn't going to continue the trial. She was going to end a web of lies built on power but paved with crime. That afternoon in court, no one saw a 16-year-old girl. They saw a walking indictment enter the room. She didn't ask for permission. She didn't wait to be called. She placed the red folder on the desk and slid it toward the prosecutor like a bullet that didn't need a trigger. Supplementary evidence? She said her voice wasn't loud, but it rang through every seat hinge. Legitimate source. Internal records retrieved from the personal estate of Captain Malik Bennett per Title 14 regarding federal property inheritance. Judge Mallory leaned back, tapping his desk lightly. He didn't ask, "What is this?" He simply motioned for the clerk to copy it. The entire room fell silent, like a ritual in progress. The prosecutor picked up the first page, then flipped to the second, then the third. His face turned pale. Eric didn't even look. He already knew. He had seen these facts. Now he saw his own name in an official investigation report listed under violation of civil rights. Beside it read, recommended disciplinary action deferred due to lack of further evidence. Lack of evidence until today. The press was granted access to the file within an hour. Images of every page were posted to legal forums, national news outlets, and personal accounts that had followed the case from day one. The hashtag #JustShock the gift from the dead climbed to the top 5 nationwide. But it was the name Amari that began trending on its own. A renowned journalist wrote, "I've been floored by brilliance like this before. Once in a criminal law class at Yale. Today I saw that same fire in a girl too young to vote, but more than ready to re-educate the very system she still expected to survive." A retired judge, one who had been present in the case Captain Bennett investigated, sent her a handwritten letter. "I stayed silent when I should have spoken. Today, after seeing you, I understand. Some people aren't born to ask whether the law will protect them. They are born to make the law into something that makes the guilty too ashamed to lift their heads." The letter was written in blue ink, the handwriting crooked but unmistakably deliberate. Her mother folded the letter and stored it on the shelf as if engraving her father's name into public memory in a way no court record ever could. As the hearing reached its close that day, Amari was asked to make a final statement. She didn't read a script. She didn't hold notes. She stood tall, eyes fixed on Eric Donnelly, the man who once thought he would live and die without ever being charged. She said, "I didn't study law to argue with you. I studied it to stop you before you hurt someone else." Not a sound followed that line. No camera, no mic, only the collective intake of breath from a room built to make people afraid to exhale at the wrong moment. Amari sat down. The printouts remained on the table, but the system no longer sat there. It now sat in the eyes of the public. And for the first time in years, justice, so often distorted beyond recognition, had a face, a name, and a deep red folder like a scar across the masquerade of truth long buried. No bell rang. No one stood up to announce it. But everyone present in the courtroom that morning knew something had changed. Not the schedule, not the law, but the air. It was taut like the surface of water about to rupture from the drop of a single stone. And that stone was Amari rising to her feet, holding a thick folder like a living indictment as she walked straight to the witness stand. No one summoned her, but no one stopped her because power had already begun to shift. "Your Honor," she began, her voice neither loud nor cold, but each word honed like wet stone. "Today I present the full sequence of procedural violations during my arrest, detainment, and case documentation pursuant to Section 512 of the State Criminal Procedure Code." She placed the red folder on the table, opened it, page by page, turned them toward the jury, and the overhead light cast the printed words in sharp relief like carvings etched into a wall of indictment. "First," she said, locking eyes with the prosecutor, "the arrest record states the time as 14:17, whereas GPS data from my personal device confirms 13:56. No proper explanation was provided. Under the law, this discrepancy calls into question the legal basis for the detainment." A murmur rose from the audience. She didn't wait for it to settle. Second hallway footage inside the police station recorded the words, "This one needs a lesson," from the mouth of the interrogating officer, violating the principle of neutrality during questioning. Eric Donnelly shifted slightly in his chair, hand braced against the table, but his palm had begun to sweat. She glanced at him not to mock, but as if to signal everything has now been dragged into the light. Third, she continued flipping to a color-printed diagram of the scene, the lines sharp and undeniable. The incident map in the prosecution's file marks the scene at 4th and Main, while satellite imagery from the same time confirms the actual location at 82nd and Grant, a nearly 50-meter discrepancy. This is not a mistake. She paused, sweeping her gaze over the jury, the audience, the attorneys, the judge, as if to ask, "Have you grown so used to being wrong that you no longer recognize it?" No one answered, but the storm had already begun online. On Twitter, a live stream clip of her holding up the maps and citing statutes surpassed 400,000 shares. The media dubbed her the girl who cross-examines the system. On Reddit, thousands of comments exploded. "Never seen someone handle court like a lawyer while still in high school." "She doesn't need a lawyer. She is the lawyer." Back in the courtroom, Amari stayed focused, unshaken by the public response. She raised her voice not to assert dominance, but to give her words weight. Fourth, under Section 318 of the Evidence Handling Procedure, conducting a search of personal property without a recorded inventory and without a third-party witness is a blatant violation, and under the law, all evidence collected in violation of procedure is inadmissible. She struck those last three words like a gavel on wood. From the witness chair, Eric froze. Sweat dotted his brow. He no longer twirled his pen like in previous hearings. He no longer interrupted. He was listening for the first time with genuine fear. Fifth, Amari stepped to the standing board placed at the center of the courtroom, an aid typically reserved for veteran attorneys. On it was a blown-up image of a fax signed by Eric Donnelly 8 years ago, confirming receipt of the investigative report from her father. "If he doesn't remember my father, then why sign the report submitted by the very man he claims not to know? I don't ask him to remember my father's fate. I ask him to remember what his own hand did." Her voice didn't shake. Her eyes didn't tear up. It was no longer a question. It was an accusation. Eric lurched forward, trying to object. But he froze mid-word because Amari raised her hand to stop him. A simple motion that made the entire room drop silent. "I'm not finished," she said. 4 words, no threats, no ceremony, yet heavier than any court-issued gag order. She flipped to the final document, a timeline chart cross-referencing footage, extraction times, archive logs, responses from independent review boards, and delayed internal reports. 4 departments, 5 documents, 1 common oversight, your name. Every delay, every disappearance, every technical error. All intersected at you. That's not a coincidence. That's a trail. The courtroom erupted, not in cheers, but in collective silence. Some clenched their fists. Others lowered their heads, unable to look the naked truth in the eye. An elderly man removed his glasses and wiped his eyes. Not because he cried, but because for once he had seen a girl who not only spoke the truth, but knew how to make the entire system answer to it. Eric Donnelly, once the man who gave arrest orders without cause, now sat motionless inside the witness box as if awaiting his own verdict. His collar soaked, his hands clasped so tightly the veins rose like cobwebs across his knuckles. No one in the room believed he was innocent anymore. No one believed in the reports he once signed. And more importantly, no one believed in the silence he once used to crush other people's voices. Amari stepped back from the board. She didn't smile. She didn't boast. She simply stood upright, silent, like a figure of justice carved in the form of a girl, but with a voice heavy enough to steal the breath from the room. She spoke the final words before the trial adjourned. "This isn't about me. It's about the people you'll arrest next if no one stops you." As soon as Amari finished speaking, the entire courtroom fell silent, as if even the air itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. A rebuttal, a denial, a counterstrike from the so-called system. But nothing came, just a dry, crushing silence that spread from the witness stand to the juror seats and eventually dissolved under the harsh white lights illuminating each face. Everybody understood the accusation was enough. She didn't speak in the name of justice. She was justice. And then just when it seemed her presentation would conclude with a triumphant silence, a sound broke out from the spectator seats. Not from the press nor from supporters. It was the faint creak of a wooden chair on the floor. A man stood up. Crisp white shirt, deep navy tie, tall frame. Thick bones like someone used to standing at a podium. Not begging for permission. He didn't ask to speak. He didn't raise his hand. He simply took one step forward and said in a voice that was clear and weighted, "I am the Associate Dean of the Harvard Law School. I confirm that Amari Bennett completed our entire pre-law curriculum at the age of 14. The statement wasn't a revelation. It was a reversal of judgment. A gavel crashed down on the wooden panel that had concealed the truth. The final bullet needed to pierce the last mask the public had placed on her. That of a trapped child, a plucky underdog, someone with no foundation to rip through the law with logic. Now everyone understood. She didn't quote statutes by chance. She didn't stumble upon violations by luck. She had been trained to dismantle the system from within its very framework. A female reporter dropped her pen. A lawyer in the second row gasped, "Oh my God!" In the corner of the room, the prosecutor tugged at his collar, as if the air had thickened, choking his throat. But none of that compared to the reaction of the one man who couldn't stand Eric Donnelly. He sat frozen face pale, his hands trembled beneath the table, gripping each other as though he could tear the fear from his own skin. But he couldn't because that one line, "She studied pre-law at 14, was a silent sentence in itself, declaring that everything unraveling now wasn't by luck, but by an intelligence far beyond his grasp. The professor continued without drama, without embellishment. Each word he spoke carried the credibility of a world-renowned educational institution. She participated in our special remote learning program designed for students with exceptional legal reasoning aptitude. I personally graded her first essay. The topic, the power transition mechanism in biased systems, how law can compel an entire structure to bow. The courtroom went dead quiet. The man didn't look at Donnelly, didn't acknowledge the prosecution, didn't seek applause. He simply bowed his head slightly as if quietly bearing witness to something that had been written long before this trial began. Amari didn't turn around. She didn't nod in gratitude. She didn't need anyone to validate her. But the presence of that professor, that confirmation, was a cold slap across the faces of everyone who had ever underestimated her. No one could say again, "She's just good at memorizing." No one was allowed to assume she just got lucky. No one had the right to sit there preaching procedure while the very child they dismissed had the foundation to teach the entire room what the law truly meant. Eric remained motionless. He stared ahead, but his eyes were dim, no longer reflecting the courtroom lights. They reflected something else. The image of himself being stripped layer by layer in front of a girl he once thought was a weak pawn. He had once cuffed her without reading. Her rights had shoved her head onto the hood of a police car, had sneered, "You think you're a lawyer?" And now not a word more needed from him. The world was answering that question with an academic resume. Even he wasn't qualified to comprehend. Outside the courtroom, the news exploded like sparks on gasoline. Young girl Amari legal prodigy was CNN's top headline at 10:13 a.m. On YouTube, the clip of the Harvard professor's statement spread with the caption, "She didn't argue the law. She rewrote how it should be used." A renowned attorney posted, "This isn't just a teenager. This is refined knowledge. This is reasoning sharp enough to sever a police chief's collar." Judge Mallory sat still, his hand resting on his brass nameplate. In a rare moment, he issued no ruling, asked no procedural question. He simply sat as if facing something that exceeded the bounds of his judicial role. Because the law, once something he thought he held in his hand, now stood before him in flesh and intellect, in the eyes of a young woman who no longer asked for permission to be heard. She was making the world listen. Amari bowed her head not to the court, but as a farewell to her father. Because today in this very courtroom, he was not only vindicated, he was fulfilled. Not by blood, but by reason. Not by tears, but by a voice that was steady structurally, perfect, not a single clause out of place. By her, the daughter the system once believed would be crushed inside the hollow machine of justice. But it was she with bare hands and an unyielding mind who had dismantled every gear and laid them bare before the public, exposed in their guilt and shame. As Eric could no longer sit upright, his shoulders sagged, neck slumped forward, sweat trickled down his forehead. His back was drenched. No one needed to give the order to cuff him, but looking at him now, one thing was clear. For the first time in his life, Eric Donnelly was bound not by shackles but by truth, a truth spoken by a girl the system once deemed unworthy of speaking at all. Eric Donnelly once walked into courtrooms as someone summoned to testify, a side character in the script of justice he knew so well he could perform with his eyes closed. But this morning he was no longer sitting at the prosecution table, no longer stood with the police, no longer wore the uniform or the gleam of the veteran officer badge. He sat alone at the defendant's table with no defense attorney at his side. The court didn't just shift, it had flipped. The girl once handcuffed in the street now sat on the plaintiff's side as a witness and as the plaintiff herself, not armed with vague accusations, but with transcripts, statutes, and files signed by his very own hand. When the clerk read aloud the headline, "Criminal Case Against Former Officer Eric Donnelly for Violations of Civil Rights Abuse of Authority Evidence, Tampering and Perjury," there were no cheers, no applause. But the entire courtroom tilted toward the girl with braided hair sitting silently, as if they all knew that from this point on, this wasn't a trial. It was an unmasking. Amari didn't need to speak. The video did it for her. On the giant screen erected in the center of the courtroom, the footage played. Not on social media this time, not through leaked shares, but here right in the place he once called home turf. He appeared. Every facial twitch captured every tone of voice. "You walked into the wrong neighborhood." Then the sound of cuffs clicking, books hitting the ground. Her voice quiet. "Fifth Amendment, I remain silent." And finally his voice snarling. "You think you're a lawyer." Words once spat as humiliation now played as irrefutable evidence. He didn't lift his head. He didn't dare look at the screen. His eyes stayed glued to the wooden table, as if by staying still, by keeping his head down, time might rewind. But it didn't. And for the first time, the one under cross-examination was him. Amari's lawyer stepped forward, voice sharp, not with volume, but with scalpel precision. "Mr. Donnelly, do you recognize your own voice in the video just played?" Eric swallowed hard, gave no reply. "Do you remember that the girl you called a better toy of the blacks is sitting here now? The one being protected by the very law you mocked?" The attorney didn't wait for a response. He turned to the jury. "And if any of you think this is just a standard abuse of power, let me ask how many faxes, how many reports, how many internal documents were altered just to bury one arrest?" A quiet wave of anger spread through the gallery. No one spoke aloud, but everyone understood this was a verdict for the organized silence, for the truth strategically strangled, for a system that had grown too comfortable using titles to trample what is right. Amari did not look at him. She sat upright, hands unclenched. Her calm. That's what made him tremble, because it didn't need screams. It didn't need fury. It just needed to exist as a living answer to everything he once believed he could bury with authority. The attorney continued presenting evidence, camera data edited out, conflicting testimonies, altered maps, audio recordings of Eric's reactions in internal briefings, and most damning of all, the leaked messages from the department's private communication system in which he himself once typed, "This girl needs to be broken in." Each message was like a nail driven directly into the coffin of the career and character he had tried so hard to preserve. At one point, a reporter leaned over to whisper to the cameraman, "We're not covering a trial anymore. We're covering an earthquake." Because it wasn't just Eric being judged. It was the system that let him exist for so many years without anyone ever asking who watches the watchers. One comment began to go viral online during the session. A black child making an entire system tremble, not with a knife, but with the truth. Beneath it was a photo of the girl sitting in court, eyes bright as glass fingertip, resting lightly on a thick printed statute book. Light reflecting off her hand, making the cover gleam like metal. The Constitution never looked this powerful. Eric still hadn't spoken. But when the plaintiff's attorney asked, "Would you like to defend yourself?" everyone turned toward him. A breathless moment. And then he exhaled, lifted his head. But what he said was not a rebuttal, not an excuse, just 3 words, as if realizing he had no path left to retreat. "I plead silence." Amari tilted her head slightly as if replaying the moment he had once spat those same words into her face on the street. But this time silence was no longer a display of control. It was an admission of guilt. The judge signaled for the clerk to record it. Online, a legal account posted a short sentence. Amari didn't request justice. She forced it to appear. She didn't smile, didn't rise. She simply glanced at the defendant's table, where the man who once dictated testimony verdicts and arrest warrants now sat hunched as if one look alone could shatter him all over again. And then in the quietest moment of the hearing, she leaned forward and said softly, calmly, but loud enough for the whole room to hear, "Now who needs a defense?" No one answered because everyone knew that question wasn't meant to be answered. It was meant to be remembered. Amari's question ended the argument with a silence stretched tight like a wire. But its aftershock didn't stop within the courtroom. The words, "Now who needs a defense?" became the final blow to the wall the system had built around Eric Donnelly for over 2 decades. But only when a wall cracks can people see the mold-covered bricks beneath. And this time the rot wasn't confined to a single case. It lay within everything the system had long chosen to ignore. That afternoon, just hours after the trial adjourned, a reporter from the Lexington Tribune, who had only come to observe the testimony, published a short article. The headline struck like a lightning bolt. Eric Donnelly and the technical error arrests. Was this the first time? The article listed a preliminary 5 cases in the past 8 years, all involving arrests made directly by Eric. All shared one chilling similarity. The victims were young people of color, charged with vague accusations like obstructing law enforcement, suspicious behavior, or uncooperative conduct. None of the 5 cases had clear video evidence. 4 out of 5 lacked meaningful legal representation. 3 victims had contested the police reports, but none were reviewed, and all 5 remained silent. The story spread like wildfire, not because the reporter was brilliant, but because the public had been awakened by Amari. She didn't need to say another word. What she had already done, cited and exposed, was the signal for the entire community to look back and begin reverse investigating. By the next morning, the National Review published an extended investigation. Donnelly's arrest map. Why are they all clustered in one neighborhood? Below was a map, each red dot representing an arrest with signs of misconduct. East Lexington, the lower middle income area, with an 80% black population, became a living indictment. And his name was no longer Officer Donnelly. It was just Eric, the one who set traps. A nightly news program replayed Amari's courtroom footage, Eric forcing the girl's head onto the hood, the books scattering his snarling voice. The host asked, if that camera hadn't been there, if she hadn't known the law, would we be here discussing a legal victory, or would we be processing a conviction no one ever questioned? That question cracked something open in viewers' minds. They started asking, how many cases like this have there been? How many times did we fail to listen because the speaker didn't have a voice loud enough to reach the courtroom? On social media, the hashtag #MushRemember, the others began to trend. Beneath it were the names long forgotten, a boy named Lamar arrested for looking around too much while waiting for his mother outside a pharmacy. A girl named Tasha handcuffed for suspicious behavior just because she was reading a book on the sidewalk. A homeless man whose ribs were broken. The report read self-inflicted injuries during restraint. All 3 were arrested by Eric Donnelly. Amari didn't share any articles. She didn't post any emotional status updates. She sat in the old room reopening dismissed cases, quietly marking each name. Her mother placed a hand on her shoulder without a word. Because this time the victory didn't carry joy. It carried the weight of a past long buried. The state prosecutor's office opened an official investigation. At the press conference, the spokesperson announced, "We are reviewing cases that Officer Donnelly was involved in, particularly those lacking independent legal counsel." A legal analyst commented on live television, "The terrifying part isn't that one officer acted improperly, it's that he did it 5 times and no one asked why they all vanished like they never happened." One of the 5 former victims, now an adult, spoke on air, his eyes no longer burning with fire. "I used to think I was wrong because they make you believe that if you react, you're the problem. They scare you so much you forget that you were ever right." His voice cracked as he said the last line. But when I saw Amari standing there, I heard the voice I'd once had beaten out of my throat. Eric remained silent. His new attorney declined all press inquiries, but in the department's internal bulletin, a leaked email revealed, "The police department will not defend actions that contradict the moral values of this institution." A senior officer speaking anonymously to a journalist said, "We knew. Someone in a meeting once said, 'Don't let him pull that crap again.' But no one stood up because standing up means losing your seat. A system that runs on compromise only needs one person who won't compromise for it to collapse. And that person was a 16-year-old girl who was once cornered on a sidewalk. She wasn't the first child Donnelly had pushed into a dead end, but she was the first to walk out holding a map of the law and used it to trace every erased name. No punches, no shouts. Just the right question. Just the precise incision. Just enough to force the system to look back. Not once, but 5 times, 10 times as many times as it takes. As long as this time, they don't shut their eyes like they always have. The silence that had gripped the system had never been broken by gunfire. It was shattered by a question, a glance, a black child stepping into the courtroom as a plaintiff and prompting the entire nation to reopen what they had long sealed away as closed history. But what hurts a system deaf to criticism the most is not the confrontation from the outside. It is the betrayal from within. That morning's hearing brought no new evidence from the prosecution. They had nothing left to shield themselves. But everything turned when an unexpected figure asked to speak. Not a lawyer, not a civil representative, but a man in uniform. With the rank insignia removed from his collar, Officer Douglas Trent, once Eric Donnelly's closest friend for 15 years, approached the stand. No one expected him to side with Amari. Trent had appeared in at least 3 tactical unit group photos with Eric. He had once spoken in a 2016 video stating, "I believe Donnelly is a straight man bold enough to act and brave enough to take responsibility." But today he stepped onto the witness stand. His gaze was steady, his voice unshaken. He had not come to save anyone. He had come to sever something he once swore loyalty to. "I used to think I was loyal." Trent began, eyes shifting from Amari to Eric, who now couldn't raise his head. "But no one should be loyal to a pack of wild dogs. And I'm not the guard dog of evil." His words were stones through glass. They shattered every bond labeled "Brotherhood in Arms." On social media, the 13-second clip had spread over 1 million times by noon. In the comments, finally one of the pack remembered how to bark in the right direction. Trent went on, "I once saw Eric falsify a report. I saw him arrest a boy just because he wore a hoodie and stood on the wrong corner. When I asked him why, he said, 'Kids like him are born to be filed.' I laughed along. I played along because I thought that was toughness. But one day I began to wake up when I saw my own son being treated the same way, just because he had curly hair and skin not white enough." His voice faltered, but his eyes never left Eric. "I'm not here to apologize. I don't deserve forgiveness, but I know if I stay silent, then I become part of the sin, and this system will keep feeding men like him with my silence." No one in the courtroom dared blink, because that testimony didn't just accuse, it exposed a mechanism, a loop of complicity. And when one link stepped out of that chain, the entire bind loosened. Eric still said nothing, but his hands clenched into fists, a reflex of those who know they've been stripped bare down to their skin. Judge Mallory nodded to the clerk. Trent's testimony was recorded, and when he turned to Amari's lawyer, his voice no longer belonged to a man delivering verdicts. It was the voice of someone who had just witnessed the gatekeeper turn his gun on his old master. "We are living a moment not written in ink, but in resolve." After the hearing, the press dubbed Trent the dagger in the blue line. But Amari didn't call him anything. As he stepped down from the witness stand, their eyes met. No hatred, no forgiveness, just a look, a quiet acknowledgement that even in a pack of beasts, sometimes one dog still remembers the real scent of justice. That afternoon, as the hearing recessed, Amari was not the first to step out of the courthouse. It was an elderly woman, frail, slow, but with eyes still clear enough to revisit something that had haunted her for the past 3 years. She had been standing on the sidewalk the day Amari was pinned face first onto a police car hood. She had heard the sound of books hitting the ground, had seen the blood on the girl's wrist. But back then, she simply pulled her grandchild away. She was afraid. Today, she was no longer afraid. I was there that day, she said in a video recorded just outside the courthouse gates, and I stayed silent not because I didn't see, but because I believed if I didn't speak, no one would ask. She didn't cry, but her words cracked open an undercurrent in the neighborhood, one so hardened by injustice that it had come to mistake it for normal. Within 24 hours of the hearing, 7 witnesses came forward. They had once been store clerks, paper boys, students passing by taxi drivers. Each brought a puzzle piece, and each one revealed the same truth. The day Amari was arrested wasn't Donnelly's first time. It wasn't a slip. It was part of a pattern, a habit nurtured by collective silence. Even more striking, the first to launch the reverse investigation wasn't a journalist. It was a group of high school students from the very school Amari once attended. On their internal network, they posted a map of the area tagging spots where random searches, stops, or arrests of students had taken place without cause. Under each red mark was the caption, "We were here." A movement began from there. The hashtag #ChuckSpeakForAmari spread across Lexington's high schools. But what confused the system most wasn't students taking to the streets. It was students demanding the right to read the arrest procedures during civics class, requesting the school to print Miranda rights and student handbooks, proposing the formation of disciplinary oversight groups with student representation. A generation that didn't ask for permission. They rewrote the rules for how they must be heard. The eastern neighborhood, once nicknamed the Gray Zone, now shone with light from the smallest of gestures. Paper signs on storefronts reading, "We do not stay silent here." Legal handbooks displayed at corner shops. Even a stone bench where Amari was once cuffed repainted with bold white letters, "We saw and we won't forget." The media couldn't keep up with how fast it all spread. One television channel reported, "A constitutional revolution on a city block." A commentator on air observed, "There's no precedent for high school students building their own legal defense network, and it all started with a girl once framed like a criminal." But not everyone stood with Amari. A group of retired officers spoke out, claiming the movement was slandering the honor of the force. They appeared on the evening news declaring, "We once risked our lives to keep this neighborhood safe, and now these kids think they can rewrite the law." Yet even as the segment aired, the live comment section beneath the screen pulsed with the same line over and over. "They are not rewriting the law. They're remembering what you tried to forget." Amari didn't give interviews. She didn't take to the streets with a megaphone, but every step she took was followed, not by harm but by learning. A ninth-grade student wrote in a shared diary, "I used to be afraid to speak. I thought saying something wouldn't change anything, but Amari didn't need to scream. She just stood firm and the law started moving toward her." In a city council meeting for the first time in history, a student was invited to speak. A 15-year-old boy with glasses, a still undeveloped voice, stood before a chamber full of officials and read aloud, "The Constitution doesn't protect those who know their rights. It protects those who use them." Behind him was a black and white photo of Amari hanging in the room like an unexpected icon of strength without fist. Eric Donnelly, once the symbol of control, now couldn't step outside his house without keeping his head down. Local officers were ordered to wear body cameras at all times. Schools installed hallway audio recording devices, not to monitor students, but to protect them from being yelled at without cause. A neighborhood that once stayed silent was now loud in ways the system hadn't prepared for. Not through riots, but through organized, informed, and principled resistance. Amari didn't ask for her name to be remembered, but every wall she once walked past now bore a single line. She didn't scream. She made an entire city listen. When Amari stepped onto the steps of the Capitol, there was no escort, no red carpet, no ceremonial fanfare, like that usually reserved for witnesses at a congressional hearing. There was only her, a white shirt, hair tied in a high bun, a thick folder slung over her shoulder, eyes neither lifted in awe nor lowered in humility, but steady like a straight line drawn across an unedited Constitution. She had been invited to speak before the Senate Judiciary Committee. The topic, legal rights for youth and the limits of self-representation in the criminal justice system. A long, dry phrase that few would care about if not for the name attached to Amari Bennett. And it was she with a presence that required no introduction, who turned a subject once reserved for scholars into a moment the entire nation was forced to reconsider. At that same time, in a local prosecutor's office, the man who had signed the arrest warrant for Malik Bennett, her father was now under quiet internal investigation. No press, no cameras. But the eyes of those he once called teammates now bore into him. They said nothing, yet their silence carried a shared verdict. The man who had once led a wrongful prosecution no longer had the standing to lead anything. A newly hired clerk, after handing him a document, didn't bow or greet as before. She simply said clearly and without tremor, "We need your signature, not your argument." A grizzled veteran walked past the corridor and placed on his desk an old wrinkled criminal code book, the same one he once cited to justify a wrongful conviction. On its cover was a handwritten note. "If you once used this to destroy someone, maybe it's time you relearn how to read it line by line." Meanwhile, on the campus of a law school in Philadelphia, a group of students hung white banners across the hallway, each bearing a line from Amari's yet-to-be-released testimony leaked just hours before the hearing. The most striking read, "The legal system is not broken. It works exactly as it was designed to make someone voiceless." A photo of that banner spread at lightning speed. A veteran attorney who had once dismissed Amari on a talk show was suddenly dragged across the internet as people unearthed case files from trials he had lost against innocent clients. At the cafe where he used to sit writing his legal op-eds, the barista handed him a receipt with a handwritten note. "Today's coffee is free like the justice you never paid for." He walked out quietly without taking his drink without rebuttal, but everyone knew he wouldn't be coming back. At the Capitol entrance, where Amari arrived, a group of young people stood by the road. No chanting, no signs. They held printed sheets of paper, each bearing a handprint, the symbol of resistance through knowledge. Among them was a 14-year-old boy once suspended for recording a classroom discussion on freedom of speech. He said nothing, but when Amari passed, he raised his sheet high, revealing a bold message on the back facing the cameras. "We don't need laws to fear, we need laws to live." In a political TV studio, the commentator who once called Amari an overhyped child gave a bitter laugh watching the live stream, then turned off his mic mid-segment. The network later announced he had taken leave for personal reasons, but it was rumored that his silence came from the realization that what he once mocked as soft had now become a measure of relevant. The hearing room that day wasn't packed, but no one checked their phones. No one left their seat. When Amari placed her folder on the desk, none of the pages were printed in color. No graphics, no executive summaries tailored for politicians, just black and white copies. Questions once denied in interrogation rooms. Statements never recorded in transcripts, wounds described as acceptable operational risk. And she didn't begin with a thank you, nor end with a call to action. She began with a single sentence. "I do not represent anyone. I am simply the final result of everything you once chose not to document." When the camera panned across the road behind her, there sat an older woman, her mother holding no flags, wearing no pins, just a beige scarf. The same scarf she had once used to wipe blood from her husband's face after he was arrested in the street. The man who signed that warrant now lived in seclusion in a retirement complex recently rejected by its new board after the public discovered his identity. He had to move out in the middle of the night as quietly as someone erasing a name from a file no one wanted to read again. And it was at that hearing for the first time the entire nation was forced to listen. Not out of guilt, but out of understanding that if they didn't listen now, no one might be patient enough to speak again. When Amari stepped onto the steps of the Capitol, there was no escort, no red carpet, no ceremonial rites customary for congressional witnesses. Only her, a white shirt hair and a high bun, a thick folder over her shoulder, gaze neither overwhelmed nor humbled, but straight like the unbroken lines of a constitution never revised. That black girl, the one once ridiculed by a precinct chief as a literate child at the wrong time, was now entering a space once closed to dissent from those without a title. The hearing room wasn't crowded, but the air was thick. No one reached for their phones. No one shifted in their chairs, not out of respect, but out of caution. Amari's presence didn't overwhelm. It irritated like a splinter in the conscience of those who had once justified injustice as unintended consequences. Outside at a nearby diner, the former prosecutor who had once described her father as an overreactive failure of a soldier, tried to avoid press cameras. But as he stepped in, the shop owner, an elderly woman who had once refused to lend Amari's mother a book, quietly placed a glass of water on the table and turned away. On the rim was a taped note, "Guess who distorted the truth, do not order." He didn't react. But to those watching, he was already gone. Not biologically, but ethically. At the same time, at a high school in the eastern part of the city, a clip of Amari's interview from 3 years ago was replayed, this time during a civics class. That video had once been cut from the curriculum because it was said to negatively affect student psychology. But today it was the principal himself, the same man who had signed the censorship order, who requested the full unedited version to be shown. He had just been exposed online with internal emails resurfacing, revealing that he had once blocked a proposal to form a legal club submitted by black students. A photo of him stepping out of his office that very morning, walking between 2 rows of silent students, each holding a piece of paper printed with the words, "We don't need permission to understand the law," had become an icon. No one shouted, no one applauded, but the entire system understood that the seats of power were trembling, not because they were being shaken, but because no one wanted to sit there anymore. Inside the hearing room, an elderly senator opened with a word of thanks, asking if she needed water. Amari shook her head. She had not come to be served. She had come to serve the memory of children whose names were never mentioned in macro-level discussions. She opened a folder and took out a sheet of paper. No color, no heading, no numbering. It was a handwritten statement from a teenager who had once been forced to sign a record without understanding what the word voluntary even meant. But she did not read it right away. She looked straight at the committee where someone had once voted against the juvenile justice bill, simply because of a lack of budgetary priority, then spoke without needing to raise the microphone. "I didn't come here to retell what you've already seen on television. I came to speak about what no one has yet asked. When a child is arrested, has no lawyer, doesn't understand their rights, and is still forced to treat silence as a weapon, can we truly call that justice?" No one answered. She continued, "When I was handcuffed on the street, no one asked how long I had studied law. No one asked how many statutes I knew. They only asked, 'Who do you think you are?' I stayed silent because I knew the law wouldn't protect me if I gave the wrong answer, and even if I gave the right one, they wouldn't believe me." A committee member frowned, preparing to interrupt, but Amari raised her hand. Not arrogantly, just firmly. "I will not take more than 3 minutes. Son." She flipped to a second sheet, her voice steady and cold. "In 13 states, minors are not allowed to refuse a court-appointed attorney, even if that attorney does not understand the case. In 20 states, the right to self-representation is not granted to anyone under the age of 16, even if they have the knowledge and qualifications to do so. And in all 50 states, not one has a clear statute ensuring that minors fully understand the legal consequences when they are detained on the street." A female senator's hand hovered over her pen. The tip never touched the paper. Amari looked up, her gaze free of resentment. Only truth remained. "I'm not asking for more laws. I'm only asking that you reread the laws. Not to save me, I've already saved myself, but to save the children who have no microphone, no live stream, no Harvard professor standing up mid-trial to declare, 'This one is good enough.'" Meanwhile, at a small police station in the state where Amari had once been arrested, the officer who misread the Miranda rights that day was sitting in the internal affairs waiting room. His name was highlighted in a report that had just been sent to the Department of Justice following public calls to review the detention of minors under the age of 15. A law student intern, while passing the file to the desk, quietly left a small note underneath. "You once said that girl thinks she knows the law. Now who is the one who doesn't know?" He looked up, no one in sight, but the eyes around him said clearly he was no longer someone people listened to. He had become a living example of how the so-called by-the-book system had begun to crack. At a prestigious law school where the professor who had once graded Amari's thesis wrote a rejection letter for a scholarship citing content too rhetorical rather than academic, his students collectively demanded the school publicly state the real reason. When he stood to lecture, one student walked to the board and wrote a quote from the hearing: "If you answer wrong, they will attack. If you answer right, they will not believe." The professor put down his chalk. The class fell silent, and from that moment on, his lectures, once replayed year after year, were removed from the school's official curriculum platform. At the editorial office of a major newspaper, the editor, who had written an op-ed attacking Amari with the phrase, "A generation of arrogant, half-baked thinkers," was forced to retract the piece after her speech clip was shared over 3 million times in a single night. During an emergency meeting, a young reporter proposed a new headline, "The Constitution Made Flesh." The editor-in-chief did not object, but the former editor said nothing, not because he had been silenced, but because he understood from that day forward every word he had ever written about her would be measured against every breath she had taken at the podium. When Amari finished her statement, she did not wait for applause. She gathered her papers, gave a slight bow, then walked away. But behind her, the stenographer looked up. The female senator from earlier hastily scribbled a note, and the oldest member of the committee placed a hand over his heart as she left the stand. In the history of congressional hearings, never had a teenager stood there and left the entire committee without a question. But Amari had no need to silence them. She only needed to make them remember that if some things are never amended, then no one will ever again be called a lawyer. Only a witness to cruelty, too afraid to name it. That afternoon, Amari's house was bathed in a quiet light from a cloudless sky. Her mother was watering the plants when the doorbell rang. The sound itself was unremarkable, but something made her pause, a familiar intuition, like the lingering scent of gunpowder in memory. When she opened the door, the man standing there did not state his name. He wore no suit, offered no title, just a tall figure in a faded canvas coat, holding a thick envelope in one hand, bound in worn leather with frayed edges. "For the girl," he said, his voice like someone who had swallowed dust and wind for many years. He did not wait for an invitation, nor did he step inside. He simply held out his hand, then stood still. Sunlight cut across the doorway, casting his shadow long on the tiled floor. Long but not heavy, as if he was used to carrying bundles of memory that others were afraid to open. Amari's mother asked nothing, but her eyes could not hide the shift. A part of her memory sprang awake at the sight of a faded red-stitched name sewn into the sleeve. She stared at him for a long moment, then exhaled softly. "You're the last one still keeping your promise." The man did not nod, nor did he deny it. He simply spoke one sentence clear enough to hang in the air. "I once promised Malik that if he fell, I would teach that child until she knew how to make even a silent society listen." A few sparrows perched on the power lines outside as if drawn into the stillness of that moment. But elsewhere, 8 blocks away, the man who once pushed Malik out of a justice post was enduring a very different kind of silence. After months of trying to fade into the shadows, his name now returned to the front page, not for any title, but for a community-driven petition accusing him with over 60,000 signatures. The bookstore chain he had invested in had to be renamed after customers boycotted the entire system. Every time he entered the nearby grocery store, the theft alarm blared. Even though he carried nothing metallic, the owner never fixed the system. He simply stood behind the counter and said loud enough, "I didn't fix it because I still want to hear that sound every time you show up." That same day, an old video resurfaced. Footage of him pushing Malik's promotion file to the bottom of the stack, saying clearly in front of a security camera, "He's a good man, and that's why I don't trust him." That sentence, once forgotten, was now remixed into background audio for a wave of TikTok videos exposing systemic discrimination. In a Brooklyn cafe, law students pinned the quote on a wallboard, "The root of all things wrong begins with those who think goodness is a threat." When that man walked by, the barista did not reject him with words. She simply placed a glass of iced water, no straw, no napkin. A bill was laid on the table with a note printed in red capital letters, "Uninvited customers still pay like everyone else." In the hallway of the high school where Amari was once dragged away before she could pack her books, a teacher rehung her photo. Not a graduation portrait, but a still from the security camera. She looked back between 2 officers, her eyes dry, holding a question she never got to ask. Beneath the photo was a line printed in italics. "Some adults wake up late because we never taught children that they had the right to doubt." That image was what forced the former principal, who had once criticized Amari for disrupting classroom order, to face questioning from the Parents' Council, ultimately compelled to issue a public apology. But when he organized a community meeting, no one came. The auditorium was completely empty. On stage, the microphone was still on, but all anyone could hear was the creaking of chairs and the lazy hum of the ceiling fan. No reactions, no outrage. The punishment did not come from shouting. It came from no longer having anyone who cared what he was trying to correct. Inside the leather-bound envelope the man had left beyond the nameless documents was a handwritten letter from Malik penned when Amari was 12. The handwriting was strong, but fractured as if written after a motorcycle crash or a brutal interrogation. "If I'm still alive," he wrote, "let me be the one to teach her how to run. But if I'm not, then find someone who isn't afraid to stand still in the middle of a crowd." At the bottom was a fingerprint faintly stained with blood, a relic of a time when good people had to sign truth with their bodies, not with ink. The one who brought the letter, did not leave immediately. When Amari's mother reached to close the door, he was still standing there quietly eyeing the dust along the edge of the nameplate by the house entrance, as if checking whether memory had been forgotten. And then, without pulling out a phone, without checking his watch, without saying anything unnecessary, he stepped off the porch, walking slowly, like a man used to swimming upstream against public opinion. On the shoulder of his coat, only one red thread remained trembling slightly in the breeze. "I once promised Malik that if he fell, I would teach that child until she knew how to make even a silent society listen." He turned away, walking lightly, as if he had never stood there. No name, no trace. But she knew that was the man who once stood shoulder to shoulder with her husband during those battlefield nights where there were no laws, only principles. A principle no one taught, but whoever kept it lived as a human being. At the same time, on the third floor of a government building, the man who had blocked Malik's path to promotion was now imprisoned in the silence of his former colleagues. His office was now merely a place for administrative notices and letters of non-cooperation. During an emergency meeting convened by the Department of Justice, a 5-year-old video was replayed. He brushed Malik's file off the table coldly, stating into the internal surveillance camera, "We don't need people who think, we need people who obey." That statement, once overlooked, had now become the soundtrack to a series of videos exposing blind obedience within the system. A highlight reel of the meeting was released within the hour, accompanied by the hashtag Courtroom, "We don't obey anymore." At the familiar bookstore he had once used under the guise of supporting education to cleanse his reputation, staff quietly replaced all category signs. The Law Society Civics section became Resistance Memory Redefinition. When he entered, no one stopped him, but the librarian silently pointed toward the restroom where black ink was scrolled across the white tiles. "Here, those who strangled others' futures are not allowed to purchase dreams." He left without buying anything, but someone had already captured that moment. And the next morning, the photo of him frozen among the bookshelves was shared online with the caption, "No one fears a nightmare if they've lived in it too long." In a northern high school during the social studies class, the teacher asked students to analyze a quote on a trending hoodie. "I don't need power, I need memories uncorrupted." Under the podium, students took turns recounting when they first heard Amari's name. But at the back of the room, a white student raised their hand and asked, "What about the one who erased her father's legacy? What happened to him?" The class fell silent. The teacher didn't respond. But outside in the hallway, a new sheet appeared on the bulletin board. His photo with a note in red ink beneath it. "No need to arrest, only need no one to believe." The students were speechless, and that's how justice entered education. Not through symbols, but through consequences. At that very moment, Amari returned home an hour later. Ink stained her hand from that morning's work, where she and her small team were building a legal self-defense system for students suspended without cause. She had just helped an 11-year-old girl write a response form to request a parent meeting when she received a short audio file, an anonymous threat, an old man's voice deliberate, "If you don't teach those kids to shut up one day, you'll be silent forever." Amari didn't call the police. She simply stored the file on a hard drive, locked in a safe next to her father's case file, where every bruise was marked with a timestamp, every ignored injustice struck through with black ink. When she entered the house, her mother said nothing, just handed her a bundle of papers. No explanation needed, only her mother's eyes. Eyes that had seen war. Buried friends who believed in something called honor restoration. She opened it, and inside was a stack of pages. Not documents, but notes. Hundreds of loose sheets, numbered, underlined, written in 2 ink colors, red for things not to be forgotten, and black for things to be used in dialogue with what is wrong. On the first page, there was only one line. When you finish reading this, you will know how to make the law no longer a fence but a blade. Amari was still for a moment. She didn't need to ask who wrote it. She recognized the handwriting, not her father's, but the person who had sent her exercises by post for 3 years under the name of a support center for disadvantaged students. Someone she had never seen, someone she once assumed was a shadowed professor, but in fact just an old soldier keeping his promise, someone who didn't need gratitude only to see her stand strong. When Harvard sent the admission letter along with a full honorary scholarship, Amari was not surprised. Not because she was arrogant, but because she had seen it coming, as every decent system must correct itself when questioned in the right place. Inside the envelope was also a handwritten letter from the university president. The penmanship careful. We need people like you not to be exemplars, but to safeguard the roots of what has been forgotten. Amari read it, folded it neatly, but did not respond right away. She placed the letter on her desk next to overturned verdicts, next to messages from students who had been denied legal counsel. Beside a handwritten line in red ink, intellect is not for winning, but to ensure no one loses. In another district, in a tin-roof room, light from the only phone illuminated the face of a middle-aged man who had worked in the system for nearly 20 years. Now, scrolling through the evening news, his face, once cold as he read out arrest warrants, now appeared in memes. Self-destructing, cop thick skin, can't mask a live stream. Achievement, 2 minutes of fame, a lifetime of disgrace. The comment flood was like a dirty waterfall. He thought he had deleted all his accounts, but somehow people still found him. A clip of him once shouting at the girl, his voice haughty, his face stone cold, was now remixed with music shared over 4 million times. The kids called it the anthem of shamelessness. And he, in every new online definition, was no longer a retired official, but a parasite of honor. On a brightly lit billboard in the city center, a new sign was hung. Not a warning, but a declaration. Not everyone in power knows right, but those who fear asking questions will always be wronged. Below it, Amari's name appeared in small but sharp font. He passed by only once and never returned. Not out of shame, but because when he tried to pull out his wallet to buy coffee nearby, the cashier, a part-time college student, left the amount field blank and typed into the machine, "This shop does not serve those who signed wrongful arrest orders." At a national education summit held in the Capitol, a young delegate stepped on the stage and began a speech. "I'm not here to tell my story. I'm here because someone once wrote this in a letter. If you don't stand up, no one will see who's sitting in the wrong seat." The entire hall applauded. The camera panned across the guest rows, landing precisely when the internal affairs officer, who had defended the cop's actions, bowed his head to dodge the lens. That clip was cut, censored from the official broadcast, but the original live stream remained, and by morning it had climbed to number 2 on the national trending chart. A small independent publishing house quietly reached out to Amari, offering to compile a resource titled Forms of Citizenship: Denial Practical Experiences for the New Generation. She hadn't replied yet, but her story had already been included in a pilot curriculum at 3 high school, including the one that once denied her the right to speak when she was in 11th grade. Now that very principal had to sign off on the new curriculum, where a bolded line read, "Education is not to teach students obedience, but to help them discern right from wrong, even when the one teaching isn't fair." That evening, in the quiet corner of a local diner, he, the man who once believed anonymity would protect him, was recognized by a 7th grader. The child said nothing, simply snapped a photo and walked away. 3 hours later, the image was on Reddit, next to a caption, "We used to believe people like him kept the streets safe." One comment read, "If he had ever stopped me, I now understand why my father said, never trust someone who looks at your face without asking your name." In Amari's small office, the yellow desk light still glowed over her case files. She hadn't decided where she would go, but she knew for every person who once signed a wrongful order and thought they got away with it, someone would remember. Not for revenge, but as a reminder that intellect without responsibility is just educated cruelty. And if one day she went to Harvard, it wouldn't be to be honored, but to dig deeper into the question, Why do those who know the most remain silent the longest? The following week, she appeared at a press conference for the Lawyers for Civil Justice organization. On a small stage among journalists, there was only one mic, no network logos, no effects. She wore a black shirt, her hair neatly braided. She held up the scholarship letter for all to see, then folded it and placed it into the donation box of the volunteer legal group. "I'm not rejecting Harvard," she said. "I'm just postponing because I believe school can wait, but justice cannot." The press room fell silent. A reporter whispered, "She just turned a six-figure scholarship into a question of ethics." She stepped off the stage, needing no accolades. But those waiting outside the hall, from a middle school boy with torn shoes to a father once arrested for obstructing traffic while searching for his son in a detention center, looked at her not with admiration, but with the knowing gaze that said, if she chooses the road they could not take, at least they will not be left behind. At that very moment, in a familiar cafe near City Hall, the former police officer who had ordered Amari's arrest was sitting alone. His face darkened from sleepless nights, clutching a cup of cold coffee. He tried to blend in, but no one looked at him as normal anymore. The server stared straight into his eyes while placing down the glass of water without a single greeting. The receipt had a handwritten line in red ink: "We do not serve old power." He stood up, left cash behind, but as he reached the door, a group of young students walked by, stopped and turned on their phones, filming him. No words were needed. They simply held the screen to his face, playing the clip of Amari leaving the courthouse, walking between two rows of silence. The very clip he once believed would be forgotten. Now it haunted every step he took. Elsewhere, someone shared a scan of the Harvard letter addressed to Amari on social media with the caption, "This is not an admission letter. This is a license for someone brave enough to stand up." Comments beneath included hundreds of stories from people who had been denied lawyers, fined for a suspicious walk, or coerced into signing statements they didn't understand. And they all asked the same question: if she chooses to study like everyone else who will tell my story. In the city council, an internal hearing on misconduct procedures was underway. One council member, who had defended the police department's procedurally correct response, was directly confronted. "If your daughter were wrongfully arrested, would you call it a systemic error?" He mumbled something, but his mic had malfunctioned, and the camera panned across the room. Someone cried, someone walked out, and someone held up an old photo of Amari. Not in graduation robes, but sitting alone reading case files late into the night in a notary office. No slogans, no hashtags, only the light from phone screens reflecting off the hands of those for the first time asking, "Where does justice begin?" As for the former officer, he sought help from a legal aid office to restore his honor. But when filling out the form, his name was marked in red, ineligible, due to unresolved public ethics record. The receptionist didn't kick him out, but in her eyes was a mix of indifference and pride, almost as if to say, "I've read too much to still believe in redemption without humility." He left in silence, not out of shame for the first time, but he realized no one in that room saw him as the center of the story anymore. The next day, newspapers said little about the event, but on community television, a short segment aired repeatedly, lasting exactly 27 seconds. Just a video of Amari walking out of the press conference, passing through rows of quiet people. No applause, no flowers, but each step she took stamped the truth. People are not waiting for miracles. They're waiting for someone willing to reject privilege, so those who never had it don't feel invisible. And just as she passed that hallway, a woman of Asian descent stood silently in the corner, holding a stack of files, tears running without a sound. As Amari walked by, the woman nodded just once, then turned away. But anyone watching understood it wasn't a greeting. It was recognition from someone who had once lived in silence, now seeing hope in the flesh, not in a slogan. A week later, Amari officially became the youngest member of the legal support group for youth self-representation in remote districts. She did not sign under the title lawyer. She signed with her real name, with a note, "Formerly arrested for reading the law." Their first office was an abandoned old bookstore. The walls still bore cracked paint. The shelves remained empty, but on the glass door, written in marker, someone had scrolled in large letters, "This is not a law office. This is a classroom for a society that once failed." Amari came there every morning. Each day someone knocked. a child who didn't understand their rights, a mother who had signed a statement without reading it, a young man expelled from school because no one could prove he wasn't trying to insult the police. He was merely asking, "Am I allowed to ask?" She listened. She taught. She did not teach people to become lawyers. She taught so no one would ever again be tricked into thinking they didn't have the right to speak. 5 blocks away, inside the small headquarters of the Department of Internal Affairs, a new internal bulletin was posted every morning. Each time Amari appeared in the media, one index column was marked in red, "Influence level beyond control." The Public Relations Office was instructed not to respond to journalists if asked about misconduct cases involving individuals no longer in the system. But even silence could not save some. The officer who had pinned Amari's forehead to a car hood the previous year was now just a name stripped of pension for severely damaging the organization's image. He did not sue. He knew with the clip now used as classroom material in multiple schools, any defense would only highlight him further as an example of failure. A bakery chain in the city's east side unexpectedly changed its advertising slogan to "Morning coffee and a timely question enough to save a life." The slogan did not include Amari's name, but everyone knew. A short video spread like wildfire. A 10-year-old child asked his mother in front of the bakery, "Did that lady save someone because she wasn't afraid of being arrested?" The mother, unaware the camera was rolling, just held her son's hand and said, she knew she'd be arrested, but she also knew something bigger, that others would start believing in their own questions. At a Bronx bus stop, a photo of the former officer was pinned to the community board, not as a wanted poster, but as a warning. This is the man who signed 12 wrongful statements, all victims under 18. Each time the notice was taken down, another reappeared now with translations in Spanish, Creole, and Vietnamese. No one admitted to posting them, but no one dared to remove them either. In the barber shop at the corner, the owner, once a close friend of the officer, refused to speak with him when he stopped by. "I won't let my chair be a seat for someone who once treated other people's heads like handholds." A new podcast titled "No One Taught Me Law" launched. Its first episode was a slow reading of an excerpt from Amari. "Justice is not found in degrees. It lies in whether you're brave enough to stop the car when you see someone being dragged away for holding the wrong book in the wrong hand." The episode was shared hundreds of thousands of times, especially among youth, where the phrase "wrong book in hand" started appearing on old brick walls. Local police tried to erase the drawings, but only caused them to spread. Now, not just depicting Amari, but also including a line, "Don't arrest me for learning faster than the one with the gun." One evening while closing files, a volunteer asked, "Why did you give up your future?" Amari didn't answer immediately. She just looked out the window where the flickering street lamp reflected on the sidewalk, the same spot where the year before her forehead had been slammed into a car hood for holding the wrong book. Then she said, "I didn't give up the future. I just didn't want to walk into it alone." And that was the greater test, not to measure how good she was, but to see whom she chose to use that goodness for. It was already dark when a silver-gray car turned onto a narrow street in the south of Lexington. The corner lamppost still flickered, as if the city hadn't yet repaired the damage from recent turmoil. Inside the car was a black teenage boy about 16 wearing a hoodie, headphones over his ears, one hand resting loosely on the steering wheel. He was driving at the speed limit, headlights on, no disturbance, no reason to be stopped. But before the green light even changed, the flicker of red and blue from a police car behind him ignited. A cold, short siren pierced the quiet, like the familiar theme song of constant vigilance. The boy turned off his music, swallowed hard, and pulled to the curb. In that brief moment, he wasn't thinking about any law. He was thinking about his mother's words. "Hands on the wheel. No arguing, no explanations. Don't act like you know the law." And then a cold sweat broke down his spine. Across the street, a middle-aged woman froze with her keys in hand as she noticed the flashing lights. She stopped. Her husband pulled out her phone and began recording. Not because she knew the boy, but because she had once seen a girl's face shoved against a car hood on this very corner less than a year ago. Inside the tea shop across the street, two students stood up and turned, eyes fixed on the glass. One of them murmured, "This angle catches the cop's face best." The boy inside the car took a deep breath as he saw the police car door begin to open. No one yelled. No one acted violently. But from the upper floors, a window flew open, followed by a voice, "We're recording. This whole block is watching. Don't touch him." The officer paused mid-step. A delivery worker from the nearby fast food joint stopped. Phone held high, and a caption appeared on the live stream. "This time, let's not make it a hashtag." The tension in the air was like static before a storm. The uniformed officer adjusted his belt and walked slowly forward. No hand on his weapon, but every eye followed his movement. From the rooftop behind window panes from inside the car across the street, the boy remained still, eyes scanning the rear-view mirror as a survival reflex. He didn't know what would happen next, but he knew at least this time he wasn't alone. As the officer approached, he didn't shout. He didn't repeat orders. He didn't flash his light into the boy's face. But the silence around him weighed heavily, as if his quiet itself was testing the entire block's trust. He stood just a step away from the window looking inside. His eyes weren't scanning the interior. They looked at the boy, a slow gaze, like making sure he saw a human, not a target. "License and registration," he said, his voice low, not threatening. The boy quickly complied, hands still raised, eyes tracking every tiny movement of the officer. The man took the papers, glanced at them, then fell into a long silence, long enough that the boy's chest began to tighten. Behind him, the patrol car lights kept flashing across his windshield, casting tense streaks over his face like invisible cuts. Then from the officer's radio, a cold voice crackled. "That vehicle's been spotted in a monitored zone. Detain the driver." Just one sentence, but it lit a fuse. The boy's face drained of color. His hands trembled. His lips moved, but no sound came. The officer didn't respond. Instead of reassuring him, he abruptly pulled out the radio, turned his back not to ask a question, but to create empty seconds, the kind that made the boy fear something terrible was about to happen. At that exact moment, a nearby house door opened. A middle-aged man wearing pajamas stood on the porch holding a phone. "I'm live streaming. Everyone can see this. Don't lay a hand on that kid," he said, not shouting, but loud enough to carry across 4 street corners. The officer didn't turn, but his shoulders twitched. "Live stream 24/7. No more room for confusion. No more darkness to hide behind." A taxi behind them honked, then fell silent, as if the driver realized he had interrupted a moment he didn't belong in. The light from a laundromat sign cast everything into a surreal stage, where every tiny action became amplified into a haunting gesture. An elderly woman rose from a folding chair in her yard across the street, cane in hand, eyes like steel locked on the officer. She didn't speak, just stood there, a witness uninvited but impossible to ignore. Just then, a black SUV parked at the corner, its blinkers still flashing. A white man stepped out, wearing a shirt embroidered with a government logo, pulling out an ID badge. "I'm an attorney. That's my brother in the car. If you continue this silence instead of following protocol, I'll call the Office of Civilian Protection." No one asked who he was. No one verified his ID. But his calm made the tension shift, as if invisible eyes were now preparing not for fear, but resistance. The officer lifted his head, exhaled slowly, and returned the license. But instead of walking away, he circled toward the passenger side and glanced at a red duffel bag on the floor. "What's in the bag?" he asked, not commanding, but enough to send another wave of tension. The boy stammered. "Books and pencils. For test prep." The officer didn't open it, but didn't leave either. He just stood there as if waiting for some wind to flip a page of memory, or for a reason to act from instinct trained more in obedience than understanding. A black woman pushing a grocery cart passed by an infant in her arms. She paused, said nothing, but her eyes sliced through the officer like a blade. As she walked on, someone touched her shoulder. A young student, also standing still, also watching the car. The crowd didn't gather, but person by person, eye by eye, phone by phone, they formed a silent chain. No chanting, no screaming, but the silence itself was the first crack in the familiar mask of authority. Another car slowed as it passed. A woman inside turned to look, her face taut. Across the street, inside a convenience store, a black child pressed his face to the glass, clutching his backpack, lips tight, as if witnessing a version of his future. The officer still said nothing. But a nearby parked car lit its interior, and the driver, a middle-aged man, pulled out his phone, and began live streaming. On the screen appeared the caption, "Another one! Don't let this one be silent." The air grew taut, not from shouting, but from silence being recorded. A light breeze passed, rustling the old shop sign above the boy. The officer looked down at the license again, his gaze slow, but this time it met the boy's face. And what the boy saw wasn't anger. It was heaviness, the same weight Amari had carried when she stood alone in court. Behind him, a teenage voice rang out, trembling with anger. "My mom said not to go to night classes because of people like you." The words weren't loud, but they made those nearby turn, and an old woman nearby said nothing, just tapped her cane 3 times against the pavement. The sound echoed like an old drum beat, one strike at a time, summoning the memories of those stopped for the color of their skin. The officer turned to look, his eyes meeting the woman's, then freezing as he noticed the live-streaming woman had stepped out of her car. She didn't speak to him. She simply brought the phone closer to his face, and in the pale blue light of the screen, every wrinkle, every drop of sweat beneath his cap became living evidence. Across the street, a window on the 3rd floor of an apartment was slightly open. A white teenager wearing glasses quietly hung a handwritten sign over the balcony. "I used to stay silent. I won't anymore." The sign tilted in the wind, flipping back and forth, creating an effect like a warning light. Not blinding, but impossible to ignore. At the same time, from the far end of the street, the sound of an engine rumbled. A yellow school bus slowly rolled past. On its dusty windows, a few children pressed their faces close to the glass. One of them lifted a finger wet with water and drew a heart. The police officer happened to glance over, and his eyes wavered. Then he returned the license. No fine, no further inspection. He simply said one sentence, "Take care. I once knew a girl like you." The boy looked puzzled. The sentence came with no explanation. But when the police car turned around and its lights flashed across the rearview mirror, the boy saw the officer touch his chest pocket where a faded plastic badge was clipped. Under the flickering light, just enough could be seen of the printed words, "Observational and Transformative Practice Program, Civic Self-Defense Organization." The boy started the car but didn't drive off yet. His hands remained on the wheel, his gaze still unsettled in quiet confusion. Not because he was let go, but because, for the first time, there was a right he didn't have to ask for. Somewhere else in a small unmarked office, a girl was still typing. On her screen was a new form for students wrongfully detained during stop-and-search procedures. Outside the door, it began to rain, but inside, a voice from an old recording she was editing played aloud. Her father's words before he passed away, still stored in a worn-out USB drive. "The law is not meant to be used against anyone. It exists to make people stop before they do wrong." Amari did not stop typing. She didn't know how long her story would continue to be told. But she knew if someone like her had once made the entire system listen, then at the very least from now on, every time a teenager is stopped in the street, a question will echo before injustice can strike. Who is sitting behind that wheel, and this time is anyone watching? No one died in this story, yet 4 officials resigned. No shots were fired, yet an entire police department fell silent. No riots erupted, no buildings burned, just a girl with braided hair who stood in a courtroom and asked questions that had always been there waiting to be voiced. A folder was opened, records examined, truth unearthed not by force but by the simple act of refusing to look away. The system didn't collapse. It simply remembered what it was supposed to be. Somewhere tonight, a teenager is reading case law instead of comic books. A mother is teaching her son about Miranda rights between bedtime stories. A classroom has replaced posters of celebrities with the Bill of Rights. And in diners across town, people no longer lower their voices when uniforms enter. They simply raise their phones, lenses gleaming like vigilant stars. The woman whose purse was searched that Tuesday still crosses the street when she sees a patrol car. Old habits linger like phantom pain. But now she looks for cameras, counts witnesses, notes badge numbers. Have you ever fallen silent when someone was humiliated before you? Averted your eyes when authority overreached? Told yourself it wasn't your business, your fight, your moment to intervene? Next time, will you still turn away, or will you remember that justice isn't something we're given? It's something we witness into existence.